מעייפות הקהל, אני מתנצל יותר מכרגיל לדבר באנגלית, אבל ולא להדליק את המיקרופון.
אוקיי. אז כבר התנצלתי, אז זהו. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, especially Chaviva Padaya for inviting me, and Roy for all the gargantuan work that you've done to make this an unbelievably heavenly conference. I want to add my congratulations to Dan and Matt, and I want to say one thing that I don't think has been said before, which is several years ago I heard Art Green said, our generation in Judaism will be known as the generation in which Kabbalah again became the center of Jewish life. And I heard him say this several years ago. It was kind of like a prophecy. And your translation and this which is really a historic work, is essential to that. And for those of us who spend a lot of our time teaching Zohar to outside the university setting, outside the yeshiva setting, but really to adults, working people, this is not only, to use Yehuda's terms, it's not only a revolution and a renaissance, it's a revolutionary renaissance in Jewish life. So I and many, many others, I want to add my thanks. Okay. My underlying theme today is the construction of subjectivity, human or metaphysical, divine or demonic, individual or collective, in dialectical relationship to that which is disintegrating, horrifying, anxiety-producing, the abyss, the Tehom. That's my theme. But since that's extremely abstract and theoretical, and the hour is late, I'm instead going to begin with a parable. Here's the parable. A holy man descends into a cave to bathe. Does he go to cool off from the summer heat, or does he go to purify himself? The parable is uncertain. Sometime after he departs the cave, a corpse, or part of a corpse, is found floating at the mouth of the cave, or perhaps unearthed from deep inside the cave. Again, the parable is uncertain. Did his visit dislodge an obstruction from the cave to release the corpse? On this point, the parable is silent. The holy man says to the priest, I have taken an oath to shun all contact with death for a year. Must I repeat the period of my oath now that I have bathed in a cave of death? The priest replies, if you have come into contact with a known contamination, tum'ah, then you must repeat. But if you have been contaminated by the contamination of the abyss, tum'at hatehom, then you need not. And the priest continues, what is tum'at hatehom? That of which no man, from one end of the world to the other, is aware. Now, I suspect that for this audience, this probably sounds something like a Kabbalistic parable, perhaps from the Zoharic literature, perhaps from a Sabbatean homily, maybe it's a Hasidic tale. But some of you will know that it's actually not really a parable at all, or rather that I've maybe transformed it into a parable. It's a Mishnah from Masechet Nazir. And my parable of the holy man who descends to the cave is actually a halachic chakira. But it is more than striking to my Zoharic ears that the Mishnah chose the mythological phrase tum'at hatehom, which is, of course, very far from being a simple opposite of tum'ah yidua. Now, I've, of course, omitted most of the halachic nuances here. To radically oversimplify, the tum'at hatehom is a kula, a halachic leniency. So why is that? Is the tehom a holy place that neutralizes the corpse? Or are these two sources of contamination that cancel each other out? Or is the tehom beyond contamination? Beyond dichotomies of tumah and tara? Or is it the transcendent holiness of the Nazir that's at stake here? Do we have a contradiction, a paradox, or a transcendence? Even before moving to Kabbalistic material in the strict sense, I've clearly ventured here into the labyrinth of venturing beyond, as explored by Elliot Wolfson, and I will continue to do so as I go along, but perhaps with a different accent. The Tehom is a place of unknown, even unconscious tum'ah, is found in rabbinic literature in several places. Notably in the Tosefta Masechet Parah, where we are told, Kevesh hayu osim me'arbayit la'ar mishcha, kipin al gabe kipin, וכיפה כנגד האוטם מפני קבר התהום. The kippah or kippim serve to protect the temple processions from contamination by the kever hatahom, the grave in the tahom, or perhaps the tahom as grave. Okay. Almost a millennium and a half after these Tanaitic teachings, Naftali Hertz Bakrach in the Sefer Emek HaMelech blends these stories with each other and with Zoharic motifs to compose a venomous anti-Christian polemic. In the Emek HaMelech, the Mishnah's Tahom has become identified with the Zoharic Nukva de Tahom Araba, the dwelling place of demonic forces, including Samael and Lilith. The Tosefta's Kippah has become blended with another Zoharic theme, one appropriated from Midrashim about the Tahom, which I'm sure most of you know, about a stone, a chunk of pottery, some kind of hard slab, a gush, a bul, which protects the world from the rising waters of the Tahom. In these Midrashim, only the casting of the slab within the Tahom can save the cosmos. It is sometimes cast by King David, sometimes by God himself, sometimes on the slab's own initiative. This slab is usually portrayed, especially in the Zoharic retellings, as inscribed with the Shema Meforash, and thus this slab may be said to embody the divine itself in its primal struggle with chaos. So how does all this become an anti-Christian polemic? The Emek HaMelech describes the great cosmic crime of Jesus as having contaminated the kippah that covers the Tahom. Now this should have been absolutely impossible, since the kippah, Bakrach tells us, is a davar she'eno mekabel tum'ah, generally immune like the Mishnaic Nazir, like God, from the Tumat HaTahom. But by making himself into a God, an El Acher, using that term Zoharically, Jesus was able to contaminate the Shema Meforash inscribed on the kippah, and thus to contaminate the divine itself. The Emek HaMelech even quotes the pasuk, Hashocheni tam betoch tumatam, to show that the contamination yields an ontological monster, a hybrid of divine and demonic. By contaminating the kippah, Jesus was able to release the demonic forces from the Tahom, most dangerously Samael, who is then able to go on to sexually contaminate the Shekhinah. And some of you will know that the pasuk Hashocheni tam betoch tumatam is also in the Tikkunei HaZohar to describe the contamination of the divine. I emphasize that though Bakrach depicts Jesus as releasing Samael from the Tum'ah, from the Tahom, he also identifies Jesus with Samael himself. Okay, how did the story of my Mishnaic Nazir, who descends into the cave and emerges uncontaminated, how did that become the story of Jesus, Samael, who opens the Tahom and even contaminates the divine itself? And what role does the acute messianic tension in Bakrach, about which we have learned so much from Yehuda, what role does that play here? What are the way stations? So the answer, of course, given the theme of the conference, it lies in the Zohar. Before going on, I just want to note, just a little narratology, that we have three basic elements in these stories. One, the Tahom. Two, the covering, the kippah, the gush, the bul, the even, the pisat cheres. And three, a subject, a protagonist, who may be holy or unholy, divine or demonic. Those are the three narrative elements in these stories. Now, before going to the Zoharic text, I want to pause at an anonymous 13th century text published and commented on by Daniel Abrams. A fragment copyists gave the title Sod Hamayim Ha'elyonim V'Atachtonim, a text that Abrams sees as L'kol ha'pachot gesher ben ha'kabbalah ha'keduma biyoter v'sifchut hazohar. The text tells us that what lies in the Tahom are holy secrets, hamistater b'Tahom hu ha'seter ha'gamur, and that the seeker of wisdom, the mystic, may be described as a doleh hanistarim mimamakeh ha'Tahom. And the text goes on to explain why it associates the Tahom with secrets. And it says this, I quote, V'amru Chazal, B'inyan davar ne'elam she'en anu yodim bo tumat ha'Tahom. V'kino b'lishon ne'elam, zot omeret Tahom, liot ota tuma ne'elemet. This is a very strange proof text. The text defines the Tahom that contains holy secrets by reference to the tahom that conceals the tum'ah of death. So is this just an analogy between two tehomot? To use a Zoharic idiom, shall we say, it tahoma ve'it tahoma? Or is there one tahom containing both tum'ah and tahara? Or is there some transmutational relationship between tum'ah and tahara? A possible clue is suggested by an earlier passage in this same anonymous text. Commenting on the biblical incident of Bnei Israel by the waters of Marah, the text says, and I quote again, quoting the pasuk, "V'lo yachlu lishtot mayim mimarah, ki hastarim amukim, ulefikach tikein lahem yitbarach k'tzat metek, moshchin et halev, ulefikach amar, sham sam lo chok u'mishpat." Now, God's placing of chok u'mishpat in the bitter waters seems to play a role almost identical to God's casting of the slab, the stone or pottery, in the tahom, in both the Midrashic and Zoharic texts. Though here, the threatening tahom, the unbearable, bitter tahom, is the reservoir of holy secrets. Now, this text uses the terms mayim mitukim and mayim marim to capture the duality of the tahom, and the text implies that it is precisely the unalloyed holy secrets that are bitter and the domesticated pshat that is sweet. Now, without prejudging the relationship of this text to the Zoharic literature, and this kind of caution we've learned in very different ways from Daniel Abrams, from Ronit Meroz, from Boaz Hus, and others, about prejudging the relationship between these kinds of texts. But nonetheless, we should note the provocative relationship of this opposition between bitter and sweet waters to the Zoharic idiom, especially to passages in which it is quite clear that bitter waters are demonic and the province of Samael. And I quote from Zohar Chelek Aleph Daf Samach Vav Amud Bet. Begin di itmain mitukin, di itmain meriran, itmain slilan, di itmain achiran, itmain shlam, di itmain ktatu, v'yalda hema me meriva asher ravu b'nei Israel tatanai, v'amshichu alayhu leman de la itzterich, v'isteivu be. So where have we reached? A tahom that can be attractive or repellent, a slab that can be pure and saving or contaminated and destructive, a subject protagonist who can be a holy man or the devil himself, or even a monstrous hybrid of divine and demonic. And so, of course, we've already been venturing deep into Zoharic territory even before getting there. So now I turn explicitly to Zoharic texts. In several places, the Zoharic literature refers to the rabbinic stories of Shimon bar Yochai, who upon exiting his own cave for the second time, performed a miraculous purging of buried tum'ah. In Bereshit Rabbah and Kohelet Rabbah, the story concerns the purification of Tiberia, which, as I've learned from Danny Matt, had been built on destroyed tombs. A Zoharic text recites this story. This is Chelek Aleph, Daf Ayin Bet Amud Bet. Rabbi Shimon have madkei shukei Tiberia, v'kol dave taman mit have salitle umadkei ara. To my ear, Zohar-obsessed ear, Rabbi Shimon's action echoes the tale of the Nazir, whose visit seems to lead to the rising of the corpse out of the cave. Though, of course, any real connection here is sheer speculation on my part. Now, the Zoharic literature has many retellings of what I call the myth of the slab, the tahom, and the subject, protagonist, rewriting the rabbinic narratives. In keeping with my theme, which turns out to be it tahoma, the it tahoma, it kippah, the it kippah, it el, the it el, I group the stories in two. One where the tahom is the source of holy shefa, and the subject, and the kippah and the subject protagonist are redemptive. I group the stories in two. One where the tahom is destructive, and the kippah and subject protagonist are redemptive. The other where the tahom is the source of holy shefa, and the kippah and subject protagonist are demonic. It's even hard to say that without things sort of itahoma melding. There are two striking things about these Zoharic retellings which suggest the complex intimacy among all these elements. First, that the slab, the even or the cheres, is not only the opposite of the tahom, but is also the Tehom itself in a congealed form. Secondly, that the kippah becomes identified with the subject protagonist, becomes personified. In other words, the subject protagonist, divine or demonic, is the congealment of the very Tehom that he opposes, or to put it more theoretically or psychoanalytically, his subjectivity is constructed out of a solidification of the abyss, which he must also reject, subdue, control in order to construct himself. So back to stories. So first, a story in which the Tehom is threatening, and the kippah, here called a Sro Shecheres, is salvific. There are a number of versions of this in the Zoharic literature, and again, caution about prejudging the relationship between the texts. I concentrate on two accounts, one in Midrash HaNe'elam Cogut, the other in Zohar Yitro. The Midrash HaNe'elam portrays the stone that disciplines the Tehom as originating in the divine casting of snow into the waters, drawing on the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. This act freezes one place in the center of the Tehom, producing Even Achat Mishukat Be'emtza HaTehom. Another sage picks up the narrative, declaring that when the earth began to congeal, the waters of the Tehom rebelled and rose up, and were only subdued when God took a slab of pottery, a Sro Shecheres, inscribed his name, Shmo Shel Ayin Bet Shemot, upon it, and cast it into the waters. In Zohar Yitro, we have a variant which seems to riff off this version. In this version, the Tzor becomes highly personified, a blending of the subject and the slab. It is also particularly susceptible to the theurgical impact of human action, and the whole narrative is presented as a drash on Lo Tisa et Shem Adonai Elohecha Lashav. When a human being makes an oath, the Tzor ascends to receive that oath. Ha'utzrora salka lekabla hahu uma'a. If it is a true oath, the power of the Tzor to pacify the Tehom is reinforced. If, however, the Tzor greets a false oath, it disintegrates and its subjectivity dissolves. So this is a quote from Chelek Bet Daf Tzadi Aleph Amud Bet. Ubisha'ata de'umu b'nei nasha uma'a l'shikra hahu tzora salka lekabla la lahi uma'a. Kevan dechazi de'ihu d'shikra kedein hahu tzora dehavi salik tab la'achora umayin azlin v'shatim ve'atva dehu tzora parchan lo tehome v'ipadran. Uba'an maya l'salka l'chafya alma ula'ahadra le'kimil kadmin. Upon seeing the false oath, the Tzor falls backward, horrified, and is dissolved into the Tehom. It does not merely retreat, its very identity disintegrates. Its letters, the linguistic center of its identity, disperse. The text portrays an experience of desubjectification. The Tzor returns to become part of the Tehom itself, thus demonstrating that this source of danger was its very womb. And I intend to, for people who know this literature, I intend to evoke theories of Julia Kristeva and also a deep convergence with the recent work of Chaviva Badaya. This dissolution of identity, produced by an encounter with a contamination of holy language, strongly anticipates the contamination of the kippah and its Shem HaMeforash by Jesus in the Emek HaMelech. In our Zohar text that I was just discussing, salvation from subjective disintegration requires a new crystallization of the Tzor. And I quote, Ad zamin kuchabrichu l'chad mamana ya Azriel, di mamana al shav'im maftechan beraza dishma kadisha, v'ya'al gabe dahu tzora, v'chakik be atvan kimel kadmin, uchedein ikayam alma, v'ya'adru mayim l'duktairu. God calls upon a prince of language to reconstitute the Tzor's identity as a subject, bounded from the Tehom. Since the Tzor's identity had dissolved into the Tehom, its reconstruction requires a reassemblage from there. Note that this official is called Ya'azriel, which we could translate as the one who will be helped by God, or, as I would prefer, the one who helps God. Another holy protagonist, perhaps a holy form of Bakrach's Jesus, perhaps Yonatan ben Arosh's Metatron. But the notion of the slab as a congealment also appears in the opposite configuration, in which the limitless flow of waters is holy, and the slab, the kippah, and the subject are demonic. My example is the Zoharic readings of the story of the arrival of Yaakov at the well of Haran, when he came from Beersheba, and his rolling off of the stone from the mouth of the well. For the sake of time, I will give something of a composite of the closely related narratives in the Guf HaZohar, I don't know if we can still use that term, in Vayetze, and with the Sitra Torah there, though again, caution about these composites. In these drashot, the limitless flow of waters is a vital flow of shefa from the uppermost reaches of the divine, from something like a holy tehom. And here I put in reference Melila's V'nahar Yotze Me'eden. You wrote that sentence, V'nahar Yotze Me'eden. So here the slab, the stone at the mouth of the well, threatens rather than facilitates the life of the cosmos, figured in the sheep of the Yaakov story. And yet this stone too is a congealment of those waters of the Tehom, of this holy Tehom now. The Guf HaZohar version tells us the stone covering the well is produced by the cosmic north that causes the waters to congeal. Limikrash is the word used. The stone is also described as Tekifu Dedina Kashya Hahu de Galib Bekarish. The Sitra Torah version highlights the demonic dimension. It refers to the stone over the well as Even Dinina Kashle B'nei Alma, Even Negef V'tzur Michshol, Kor Yishayahu. This text, the Sitra Torah text, also stages a meeting between the holy and unholy subject protagonists. For standing on the stone, or identified with it, is none other than Satan. And Yaakov's removal of the stone from the well is called Irbuvia de Satan. This Satan, who appears to be identified here with the stone, is undoubtedly one of the sources of the Emek HaMelech, Jesus Samael. He is a demonic subject protagonist who is a congealment of the holy Tehom, going back to my theme, my abstract theme of subjectivity as a crystallization of a formless and threatening alterity here on the dark side. Just as the Tzor is an association of the holy slab and the divine subject, protagonist, so the well stone is a union of the demonic slab, the demonic stone, and Satan himself. And each are congealments of their adversarial Tehom. So the passage in the Emek HaMelech with which I began this talk is just one variant of the dialectics of the Tehom, the Kippah, and the subject. But I suggest, speculatively, that we should see this engagement with the El Acher, with that El Acher who is Jesus, Samael, as essential to the messianism of Bakrach. Now, not long after the Emek HaMelech was written, another text was written which brings out the full paradoxicality of this entire discourse. And it is perhaps unsurprisingly a text by Natan Ha'azati, my namesake, from the Drush HaTanimim. And this is an excerpt. Madua nish'ar ha'tahom ba'olam hazeh. Ha'tam hu, שבכל פעם שהקדוש ברוך הוא עושה נס גדול, בורר מסוד התהירו הזה ברורים, ונתהווה ממנו יצירות, שיוצר האל יתברך על ידי נפלאותיו, וזה סוד הכתוב, קפאו תהומות בלב ים. גם מלך המשיח כבר בירר כמה פעמים ממנו, ועל התהום הזה עומדים סמאל ובת זוגו. Now, elsewhere in this text, Natan Ha'azati tells us that the Tehom, which he identifies with the Tehiro, is the place of the demonic, the klipot. And yet, here he tells us that it is also the great reservoir of life and the resource of creativity. The Tehom is ambivalent, other even to itself. It is only by descending into the home and performing berurin, like Rabbi Shimon, perhaps like the Nazir, perhaps even like Jesus, Samael, can there be new creation and wonders. In Sabbatian mythology, this ambivalent place is also the original place of the Mashiach himself, a teaching we already know from Kabbalat Ari and Shar Gilgulim. V'al ha'tahom hazeh omdim Samael ubat zugo. And given the ambivalent potential of the Tehom, these figures too have become figures of ambivalent potential. And it is an engagement with these ambivalent others that messianic hope lies. And I'm not sure if this is me saying it or my text. Maybe this is the secret teaching of the Emek HaMelech, or maybe this is a way of reading the Emek HaMelech against the grain. And perhaps it is even the secret of the Mishnaic dream of the non-contaminating Tumat HaTahom itself. Thank you.
אני בטוחה שיש מבקשים להעיר, להוסיף, יהודה. פספסתי מישהו? בבקשה.
נשקפנו בתאורות, זו הבעיה.
תודה רבה. אני מצאתי את ההרצאה הזאת מאוד מהירה חושך. רציתי לשאול, אתה דיברת על אי תהומה ואי תהומה. האם העלית את השאלה אם תוכל קצת לחדד אם זה שני ישויות נפרדות בעלות מעמד מיתולוגי, או שזה כמו דו-פרצופי, שזה קשור בפונקציה של הפעילות שלהם. כלומר, אותו דבר טהור, שזה מופעל בצורה שלילית ובתוכניות סטרה.
Okay, so that is the question. It's exactly that. I think the question. I think the way in which the Zoharic literature raises these kinds of questions is designed precisely to provoke this question. For example, the Tehillah in the Zohar, which is the highest thing, is described in terms that are very much like the way it describes the Tehom. So much so that in later Kabbalistic literature, you can have the phenomenon of, say, Natan Azati and the version of the Kabbalah Tari that he inherited as identifying those two things, even though in the Zohar they're clearly opposites. So I think that just as the Zohar is meant to, litashtesh is not quite the right word that I'm looking for, but it makes you constantly transition between Elyonim and Tachtonim, as we heard from the previous talk. I think that the formulations that I particularly focus on in the Zohar, the it, is both provokes the sense of absolute opposition and yet identity, because the words are the same. Okay, so the Zohar loves to say itzadeh v'itzadeh, basically referring to the Shekhinah and Lilith, right? But in which the difference is where the words are identical, right? Separated only perhaps by a vav, by a single line, right? And it's designed, again, I think, ostensibly to project absolute opposition, but linguistically it also suggests intimacy or perhaps identity. And your question is exactly that, right? It's exactly between this idea of these two yeshuyot. Are they different? Are they the same? I think that linguistically, this is the kind of thing that Zoharic literature is provoking, as well as certain other kinds of Kabbalistic texts as well.
אולי רק להוסיף מילה אחת בקשר להקשר של אבן השתייה, שזה כמובן השם המדרשי המקובל. אותה אבן שתייה מכונה במגילות מדבר יהודה בשם סלע ציון. זה המקום שאליו דוד אמור להביא את המשכן למקום המקדש. קשור להר ציון המקראי ולתהומות של ישותנו וכן. תודה רבה לך על הרצאה מאלפת. הדוברת הבאה של